So today joining us on the panel we have a range of speakers who will help us further explore some of the, the coexistence perspectives. We've got Mike Kaiser from the Department of Resources, Georgina Davis from QFF, Andrew McConville from APPEA, and Mayor Paul McVeigh from Western Downs. So I'll just open the panel discussion up. And Mike, I might throw to you first. And I just wanted to ask you about, the regulatory framework, because it is such an important component of the coexistence picture. But in your opinion, how would you rate the effectiveness of the current regulatory framework and policy settings we've got in relation to gas development and the coexistence agenda?
Well, look, we spoke, Andrew and others have spoken a little bit about the challenge of measurement. And I guess one of the measures for me about the success of this regulatory framework is keeping people out of the land court. I think that's a really, worthwhile objective. I've known the president of the land court for 40 years. I've known her since we were both students together. And I think, that's important. If we can save companies and landholders from the trouble and expense of being in court, I think that's a really important role for a regulatory framework to play. And I think it's also that unique combination of things that we have here. We've got the GasFields Commission looking at the relationship. We've got the Land Access Ombudsman looking at disputes more and more. And we've also got OGIA and DES looking at the science. And we talked about the science earlier playing an important role in all of this and trying to have science and evidence-based discussions. I worry about that a little in the sense that I don't think we can ever move completely away from the fact that these are deeply emotive issues, particularly for landholders and sometimes for gas company executives. Occupation of land is the sort of thing that's caused wars in the past, and they're deeply held views and beliefs about what people can and can't do and what they've got a right to do. So I think they are deeply emotive issues, and we lose something if we don't recognise that. The other thing I'd like to say, though, is, and this might sound strange coming from a regulator, but there is a limit to what regulation can achieve, I think. Regulation can tell a company what it can do and can't do, but it can't tell a company what it should do. And I think, Cecile, you were making some allusions to that. And there's a big difference between can do and should do. And when you start considering should do, you get into ethics and moral considerations and trust. And there's a great framework by one of your colleagues, Andrew Nicole Gillespie, around organisational trustworthiness that essentially breaks it down into three components that I think are worth thinking about in this context of the gap between can do and should do. One is competence. You have to be able to competently deliver what you say you're going to deliver. You have to act with integrity, and there are issues of transparency and those sorts of things. But then importantly, it's also shared value. You have to, in order to build trust, you have to share value. So any company, I think, that's operating closely to the community, that consistently prioritises shareholders over other stakeholders, is going to run foul of that trust equation and not make that leap from can do to should do. And that goes well beyond, sharing value goes well beyond philanthropy. It goes to some of the things that we've heard today about, genuinely sharing the value that's created through the enterprise with landholders and with communities beyond just donations to the local footy club.
I might address this to Mayor McVeigh, actually. We've heard throughout today, in fact, I feel like, the industry, has given itself a bit of a pat on the back about how far things have come and changed over the past decade and 15 years. From your perspective within the community in the gas fields, though, what do you see are some of the things that we still need to keep our attention focused on, or what might be emerging or blind spots for the industry?
Great question, Rebecca. Thanks very much for that. Can I just say first up, thanks to all the resource sectors here for the contributions they do make to our region and how our region has changed over the last probably 2 decades. And Ian made comment about 18 years ago, and that's actually my first experience working with obviously the gas industry, coal seam gas industry, and that ongoing development. And it was a challenge back there, and there's been a few words said today about coexistence, all those things we're talking about. And I like to use the word that Ian spoke about is in partnerships, and how we go forward as communities. And Cecile made a comment about two partnerships and two of areas of coexistence, which is the coal industry and extraction of gas, and then was working with our farming sector to come onto their properties. The bit we have missed, Rebecca, and I really appreciate this part, is our communities. And I do think that is the third area that we really need to be looking at, how we actually grow the understanding. And we're getting there, and it's all about partnerships. And I'll go back to probably my first few months of being mayor back in 2016, and we had quite a serious issue out in the Miles area, just trying to get things to, and we're at the down end of the construction, and things were really, really flat. And there'd been a tremendous amount of investment, and people got carried away with that opportunity that was going to be here, and there was sort of no tomorrow. But it was in that construction phase, and our communities were really hurting. And I attended this meeting, and I parallel with what some of Ian's comments, we were sitting at either sides of the table, and we're just throwing rocks at each other. And I was invited out there to have this discussion. And it was about working together in partnership to improve our communities. And that went on, and we won't mention the companies, but it was just, it could be any company. But we worked together, and this is still about the communities, to actually, how do we create that benefit for our communities? And we did our camps. With some camps we can't do it. I know they are needed, but it's the contribution. If you're going to be part of our community, and I think this is really important, the message about, as a resource sector, anyone, it doesn't matter if you're starting a business in out there, you've got to be part of our communities to really take ownership of being part of our communities. And that is still an ongoing effort. And I'll go back to Ian's comments. He had the old cotton picker up there and the modern day picker. And it's 40 years that I actually was one of the very first cotton growers to grow irrigated cotton on the Jimba Plain. And I had, Ian will remember, John Hewitt and a good mate of his come over and said, this is a grain growing area. You do not grow cotton on the Jimba Plain, you know. And this is a cotton grower trying to talk me out of it. Now, for about probably the next 20 years, and it's great to see our cotton industry leaders here, we took a fair bit as an industry. It doesn't matter what area we lived in, but we progressively listened to our community and partnered with our communities and became part of our community. And I think that's, now today, I see that the cotton is just part of what we grow. That area now is 50% cotton. The same with the resource sector. It doesn't matter what form it is, become part of our community or not. That is an ongoing challenge. And so for myself as mayor of a region, that we want the resource sector to be part of our community. And I can't make it any simpler than that, but that's a challenge. That's up to the people that drive both industries, people like myself that lead our communities, to make sure that we're actually being very positive about how we go forward.
Thanks, Mayor McVeigh. Georgina, I think might segue to an ag sector question now from a QFS perspective. Any particular challenges or impediments that you see on the horizon or over it from a coexistence with the ag sector and gas?
Mm-hmm. So we heard this morning some of the concerns, groundwater. Certainly for our membership, intensive irrigated agriculture, groundwater is something that does still provide a lot of concerns. The cumulative environmental assessment processes, they are complex. They are a challenge. And we saw in 2013, obviously under the PBC Act, what we affectionately term as a water trigger. But I would say there's still key gaps in how cumulative effects are actually considered in practice under that water trigger. There's still issues. And particularly important in cumulative effect assessment is actually that element of time. And this is actually central to many concerns around CSG, particularly the groundwater story. So there's various frameworks for how we do the assessments, from the initial scoping, the spatial, the temporal scoping that we do in the exercises. We look at past, present, future activities, impacts, and then we do a technical assessment, which essentially is fundamentally a prediction of what's going to happen into the future. So through to effects management. So when we actually find there's an effect and we do something to address that effect, how do we mitigate those predicted events? But then how do we re-establish or redetermine those cumulative effects? And time elements are actually the critical piece for all of those types of assessment. So I suppose very quickly, and Ian mentioned the adaptive management process, and it's something we still run very much in Queensland, particularly with the EA type process. And I think, adaptive management, it can't substitute for effectively assessing those cumulative effects, since the cumulative degradation could actually be quite substantial. And there's time lags between adjusting your management and then seeing a response that may mean that degradation is continuing even after you've had that management adjustment. So this is actually true where we've got groundwater fluctuations, which we know are occurring in these areas anyhow, and there's a whole reason for that. But a lot of these current assessments, one of my biggest concerns is that they're not looking at climate change and how that's actually going to impact some of the groundwater quality and quantity assessments. Now, some of that water use that will be impacted by climate change actually probably won't be CSG water use, but we're not necessarily including it in the assessments that we're doing. So I think, that leads me to worry a little bit that some of the current assessments are actually underestimating what I would say is the cumulative effects, and that approving, we could actually approve greater than expected ecological and hydrological impacts going forward. So I think, very simply, what we need to do, one of the opportunities is we actually have to improve the temporal assessment of what we are doing, those cumulative impacts, to take into account all water uses, not just the CSG element, but all of them. And, to give you a bit of an example about how we all think about time, the idea of long-term impacts does need to be more transparent. And we have to make sure that the science and management of those impacts is better and improving all the time, which I think it is. But as I said, I think we still got this fundamental omission with climate change and some of those other factors that are changing water usage. And, just from a personal point of view, effects that last longer are deemed to be somehow more significant. So certainly from our personal sort of risk perception, but also in terms of ecological outcomes, we see that those longer term risks can be more significant. And this is where really I think a lot of the farmers' concerns are that, CSG projects are looking at sort of 20, maybe 40 years. Farmers very much see themselves here as in perpetuity. So there's this disconnect between a project that may have significant impacts into the future that may not actually be registering those impacts. And actually, when I had a look at the number of EISs, and I just had a look at 10, and actually hats off to Arrow, because their Bowen gas project in their EIS looks at an effect duration of around 1,000 years, and that was cumulative assessment. But the other 9, nothing, absolutely nothing beyond the actual extraction time of the project. So I think that's a little bit of a worry. And I think, farmers are making decisions on intergenerational equity and those other things. And I think the science and the regulatory regime needs to sort of reflect those timeframes.
Thank you. Might throw to the floor again. Has anyone come up with a question in that? Oh.
So I think it's for both Andrew and possibly also for Georgina, which is, so we heard a little bit about, you mentioned ESG this morning, and the landscape of ESG for both sectors actually is changing with a greater focus, for example, on greenhouse gas emissions. I wondered if you could just, first of all, Andrew, if you could just make a comment on how you see that landscape changing. And then for contrast, it would be good if you could do the same. Would that be okay? Sure. Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Alf. Look, it's changing really, really rapidly. We're seeing it impacting on capital flows in particular. And, ours is an industry that you've got to continue to invest in order to maintain that production. So what we're seeing is the providers of capital have adopted strong ESG positions that they then want to see adopted by those to whom they are lending the capital. So we spend a lot more time now engaging with ESG analysts. I think where the risk is, and that's fine, and that's part of what we have to do, and that's the expectation. And I actually think, the industry has a very good story to tell in terms of its ESG credentials and the role that natural gas can play in emissions reduction. Where the risk comes in is that ESG debate is hijacked by particular activist groups, and that's where it starts to get problematic. We see increasing shareholder activism impacting on AGMs and the like, and that's where it becomes problematic. We also see it impacting on the role of industry associations, for example, and yet industry associations are the very thing, if you like, the glue that can hold the different stakeholder groups together. And so, my member companies are coming under a lot of pressure to justify their membership of an organisation like APPEA. So we spend a lot of time talking to ESG analysts around, well, what is APPEA, and a bit like I think. What was said here this morning, it is, and I think Ian made the point, a 30-minute conversation can really change that. We had a session last week with one of the largest super funds in Australia, and it would absolutely blow your socks off as to how little these folks knew. And yet they are making the investment allocations decisions for literally billions of dollars of capital. Similarly, I won't name the bank, but we had a conversation with one of the big four banks just recently with their CEO and senior executive team. And again, it was absolutely frightening at how little they actually knew about what the industry does and how the industry acts and behaves around all of the issues we spoke to today. And yet you've got the activists over there then saying, well, you as APPEA don't have a role. Well, that's exactly the role we should be playing in talking to these groups. So it's becoming incredibly important. We're starting to see international pressure as well. So whether it be TCFD or other international conventions, and it is just a reality of the changing landscape we're in. And member companies are going to have to understand this is a relevant part of their license to do business. But the impact of all of that is it takes a lot of time and a lot of money in order to address that, and that's really, really challenging. And so the best thing we can do collectively is exactly these sorts of collaborations, because the most powerful thing that can happen is not for me as the representative of the oil and gas industry to stand up, but someone like Ian to stand up and say, well, actually I can work with these groups, or Mayor McVeigh to stand up and say, these guys have made a significant contribution to the economy. That's where the narrative has to come through. So, but it's a hugely challenging issue, Alf, and it's only going to get bigger.
I think some of those issues are the same for any sector, including agriculture. And in fact, now we are seeing a little bit of a push against what is commonly termed as industrial agriculture, and I think that will persist into the future. But that said, I think carbon has tremendous opportunities for agriculture. We're seeing a range of green market mechanisms, not just carbon. We're seeing reef credits. In October last year, we saw the first reef credits being issued from HSBC. We're seeing biodiversity credits and certification schemes coming in. The one thing I think that does concern me is that there is an awful lot of focus just on carbon. Carbon is not an environmental indicator across the board. It doesn't necessarily result in good ecological outcomes. So whilst we should be watching carbon, we should also be looking at things like ecological outcomes, making sure that they're robust. And I think agriculture's doing a good job of that, but we need to be better, not just because there is an opportunity there for extra income to diversify income on farms, but we are now seeing other countries with very ambitious, in particular carbon targets, start to introduce, I think, what our Prime Minister called protectionist measures. But really, all they're doing is making sure that their imported goods have the same emission intensity as those that are domestically produced, so that they're making sure there's a level playing field for their own industries and their own farmers. So in order to continue to be importing into Japan in 2022, Europe into 2023, Queensland's agricultural produce and indeed Australia's agricultural produce will have to demonstrate, there will have to be a certified process of ensuring and demonstrating that we can meet that level playing field that's been set by the countries. So yes, it's challenging, but it's a great opportunity.
It's actually quite interesting, just harking back to what Andrew was saying about the banks, just having a look at the stakeholder groups that we're dealing with these days. It's much more diverse. It's not just the companies, Landholders Council. It's, we're finding, engaging with the banks, the insurance sector. These are non-traditional stakeholders for us. Those information gaps exist, not just in terms of, about the industry for landholders or communities, but in those other organisations. Look, we are over time. We might just have open the floor for one more question, if there's anything out there.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Robert Gard, Denizen Gas. Look, I guess we've been talking about harmonious and even mutually beneficial coexistence between landholders, gas companies and even mining companies. But we sort of exist and work on a playing field which is governed and managed by the various government bodies, the federal, state and local government. So my question is, what part can these government bodies play in making that playing field easier for us to coexist more beneficially?
That's exactly our brief. I mean, we want on behalf, government wants on behalf of the Queensland people the benefit of the agriculture sector, the benefit of the resources sector, and increasingly the benefit of the renewable energy sector, which is, you're going to need another circle down the bottom of your banner there, Warwick, because you look at the scale of the renewables energy sector, the scale of what's intended, and it will have considerable impacts on both the resources sector and the agricultural sector. It's going to be a big new player in this coexistence space because there's so much of what the renewable industries does that kind of has the potential to sterilise land or cause other impacts, not just on agriculture but also on resources. So the job for government, in a nutshell, is to try to balance all of that in the public interest. And on behalf of the public, we want it all. We want the benefits of all of those industries, but we don't enjoy the luxury of them existing in different locations. They exist all in the one location, and we need to, we need to find those balances. But I just quickly repeat what I said before. None of these industries, agriculture has its impacts too, whether it's agriculture, renewables or gas or resources, none of these industries can comply their way to a trusted relationship with the public. You can't comply your way to trust. There's a gap between what you should do and what you can do, and I urge you to think about what you should do, not just what you can do.
Warwick, and 100% agree with what Mike has just said. And I think between the state, or the federal, the state and the local, one of the things we need to focus on is reducing duplication. And the reform of the EPBC Act is a really good example of that. And here in Queensland, the Joint Industry Framework is a really good example of collaboration between the federal government and the state government to reduce that duplication. WA, single point of contact, same thing. So I think wherever we can find opportunities to reduce duplication is one. And the second, it's a bit like the relationship that the industry needs to have with the landholders, which is built around good information, predictability, so on. It's the same between the extractors of the resource and governments. Companies aren't against regulation. What they're against is bad regulation or unpredictable regulation. If you set the bar and you leave the bar, then the organisations will jump the bar. And I think it's about getting that predictability and transparency right as well. So reduce the duplication, get the framework right, and then let it sit, I think is really crucial. And getting the levels of government to talk to each other so that they're not trying to out-compete each other on regulation. It's got to be objective-based regulation.
Warwick, I might just make a quick comment.
Absolutely.
It's quite interesting from a local government point of view, and especially from the Western Downs point of view, where we've got all forms of the energy sector there, and we talked this morning. It's about this conversation about rural and the resources coming together, and there are legislations there that we don't control at all, but there are opportunities from a local government point of view where we actually have those conversations. There's a financial benefit to a rural community that has the resource sector putting its footprint across our region, and to manage that, and whether that's a benefit in our roads and those sort of access agreements, or even just our water and those sort of water and waste for our communities, where the whole community benefits. But can I just go to the comment that Mike just made about the renewables coming into space, and we're approving. We've got quite a large number of renewable projects in the region. But one of the things we've been challenged with, because even if we decline some of those, they could go on to state and get approvals, and we've seen that happen. So what we've actually organised within our council is having that conversation. So we actually sit around the table and talk, and we've managed to have, especially solar farms, relocated in a great conversation where we're looking at good quality agricultural land, and we're wanting these probably in not that same space. And a great example, we had one conversation with a proponent, and it had a significant footprint on really top quality agricultural land. And we had that discussion, and out of that discussion, and plus we've also actioned that we've identified opportunities where they can actually set up. We wound up with 2 solar farms out of that approved, and they took their footprint away from that really, really high quality agricultural land. And that's also another challenge for government. I don't want to get into politics, but if you go around our region and look at good quality agricultural land, that really needs redefining significantly to what is really, really high quality agricultural land, and what is a great opportunity to add another tier of economic capacity to our region.
Yeah, some really interesting analogies there with the gas experience, and that, openness to, I guess, change when you are negotiating location. Just so powerful. All right, well, we're a bit over time, and I think I would love to keep this conversation going. It's been very, very valuable, and there's a lot of energy there, but we might just call it quits on the panel there, and if you put your hands together and thank the panel members. I think that was great. Thank you very much.